program will begin in a moment. Good afternoon. My name is Max Latona, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Ethics in Business and Governance at St. Anselm College. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you today to this afternoon's webinar, Better, Not Perfect. We have a very special guest today who will be properly introduced to you by my colleague, Kyle Hubbard, in a moment. Before he does so, I'd like to say a few words, very brief words about our center, especially to those of you who may be hearing about us for the first time. The Center for Ethics in Business and Governance at St. Anselm College was established to help communities and organizations in the region to address many of the ethical issues that they face, and to do so through collaborative research, education, and discussion. The core of what we do is dialogue and collaboration, in part because we think this is the most effective way for organizations and communities to get results, but also because learning to listen, to truly listen and learn from one another is perhaps one of the most ethical things we can do. Now, today's program takes place as part of our Ethics and Governance Forum, which features prominent speakers offering insights about stewardship, governance, leadership, and business ethics. The forum is funded from a $2 million endowment created by the New Hampshire Secretary of State's Office and the Center for Public Responsibility and Corporate Citizenship. That endowment was created by a settlement reached between the state of New Hampshire Securities Bureau and Tyco International in 2002. To learn more about our ongoing series of programs, I encourage you to visit our website, anselm.edu/ethics. Now, finally, I'll just mention that in accordance with New Hampshire state law, I must inform you that this session is recorded. It is now my pleasure then to introduce my colleague, Associate Professor of Philosophy, Kyle Hubbard, who teaches business ethics here at St. Anselm College, and he will provide a proper introduction to our speaker today. So Kyle, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Max. So as Max Latona mentioned, I teach a course in business ethics, so I want to say a particular word of welcome to some of my business ethics students that are on the webinar today. And just welcome to the rest of you who are joining us to hear from our speaker, Professor Max Bazerman, who will speak to us on the topic, Better, Not Perfect. For about the last 7 years, the Ethics and Governance Forum has featured speakers on topics related to governance, leadership, social responsibility, and the common good. I believe, I could be corrected if I'm wrong, some of our longtime supporters who might be on here might be able to tell me differently, but I believe that Professor Bazerman is the first speaker that we have invited back for a second time. So that should indicate what our audience thought of his talk the last time when he talked about the power of noticing. And it should indicate the treat that we are in for today as he speaks on how to make ethical choices in our numerous everyday decisions. As you read on the slide, Professor Bazerman is Jesse Isidor Straus, Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Professor Bazerman has authored or co-authored at least 12 books by my count, including The Power of Noticing that he spoke on last time. He's edited many more books, many dozens of book chapters and articles in the fields of ethics, decision-making, and negotiation. So before I turn it over to Professor Bazerman, let me give you some instructions about how the question and answer will work. You may submit questions at any point during the talk by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your, at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We'll be selecting questions for Professor Bazerman to answer from those that come in. We'll try and get to as many of them as possible, but there are plenty of audience members on this webinar, so I cannot promise that we will get to all of them. So just ask your forgiveness ahead of time if I'm not able to get to your question. So now that the housekeeping is out of the way, please join me in welcoming Professor Max Bazerman.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for taking time out of your schedule during a very strange period in our history to join the seminar today. I appreciate that. And Professor Latona and Professor Hubbard, thank you for inviting me. I feel quite an honor to be invited back to the same institution. So I want to thank you for allowing me this opportunity. So my goal today is going to not be a very humble one. I want to give you some ideas that I hope will change your behavior. And the ideas that I provide, and quite honestly, I don't know which of the ideas will affect your behavior, but I'm hoping that at least some of them will change your behavior. My goal is not to make you perfect, but simply to make you better. And we'll define what better means as we sort of move along. Now, a little bit of background on myself. Next slide, please. By background, most of my work has been in the world of decision-making and negotiation. So Mason, can we have next slide? Yeah, thank you. So, and in the world of decision-making, the goal state is rationality, to make the most rational decision we can, where rationality can include lots of other things other than your own financial well-being. It can include the outcomes of others, non-financial outcomes. It simply means making decisions to get more of what you want to achieve in life. And as many of you know, there's this emerging field of behavioral economics that studies why we don't seem to get there, or the systematic and predictable departures from rationality. And much of the research in the last decade has focused on how do we get people to become more rational? How do we debias people's biased judgments? How do we lead them to system 2 or more deliberative thinking? And how we can create environments that more naturally lead people to wiser decisions. Next slide, please. And as I move from the world of decision-making and negotiation to the world of ethics, which is the domain of the center of your center at St. Anselm, the goal state becomes different, and philosophers have debated what the goal state should be for a moral decision for many, many centuries. And I'm certainly not going to enter that realm today. Rather, I'm going to adopt what philosophers would call a utilitarian perspective. And what I want to do is provide some ideas on how you personally can maximize the value creation that exists across all sentient beings. Now, you may not fully endorse that, and that's okay for a variety of reasons. And whatever those reasons are that you don't endorse that as a goal state, I just want to suggest that after we meet whatever those alternative goals that you have are, within those alternative goals, you probably still would rather do more good than not. And that's what we're going to try to achieve. But there are a variety of bounds to acting in a fully utilitarian manner, including biases, but also selfishness, mythical fixed pie, assuming what's good for you is bad for other people, tribalism, overvaluing your own group in comparison to others. And this talk is explicitly about how to move toward more utilitarian behavior, again, where utilitarianism means creating the most good for the greatest number possible. Okay, so next slide. So here's a quick set of sort of bullet points on what I think of as utilitarianism, maximizing aggregate pleasure and minimizing aggregate pain, being efficient in the pursuit of the good that we want to create, making decisions independent of the preferences based on our own wealth and status in society, and valuing the equality of interests of all, and avoiding tribal behavior, such as nationalism or in-group favoritism. And those sound pretty good, but I would simply highlight that it becomes a little bit hard to achieve some of those items, even the ones that we would endorse, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so now to the first fun part of the talk, where we get out of definitions and we work toward a decision for you to think of. And I'm sure that at an ethics seminar, many of you have seen a problem that looks something like this. But if you have seen something like it before, I'll ask you to pay careful attention because mine's a little bit different. My version of this problem is a little bit different, but this is a very, very famous problem in philosophy, or an adaptation of a very famous problem by Philippa Foot. But it's also been on TV in multiple places, including the TV show The Good Place. And to orient you to this problem, I want you to imagine that you are the person with that question mark over your head, and your decision is whether to switch or not. And that train coming down the track is headed to the left-hand part of the screen. And if you do nothing, the result will be those three innocent people will get hit by the train, die an instant and painless death. And the reason you come into this story is you don't have time to jump in front of the train or do anything else. Your only choice is whether you're going to turn that lever or not. And if you turn the lever, that will move the train off of the left-hand track and move the train onto the right-hand track. You will save the three, but unfortunately, that innocent person on the right will pass. Again, an instant and painless death. So the question is, would you switch or not? And a lot of you want to know who they are, what political party they come from, whether you know any of these people. But these are four anonymous people involved in the decision. And I can tell you, based on lots of past experimental work, about 3/4 of the people say they would switch, okay? That they would switch to save the three, even at the expense of the one. And this is the essence of utilitarian thought. Do the greatest good or for the greatest number, or minimize as much harm as you possibly can. There are some of you who have perfectly legitimate reasons why you wouldn't do that you don't want to play the role of God. You might be blaming people for being on the track. But all I want to tell you right now is 3/4 of most audiences switch. But now let's take a look at another problem. Next slide, please. And this time, you'll recognize the train. It's coming down the track. If you do nothing, it will hit those 5 people. They will die an instant and painless death. But this time, what you can do is you can turn a switch. And if you turn a switch, the floor will drop out underneath that guy on top of the bridge. He will fall onto the track, get hit by the train, die an instant and painless death, and become what's technically called a trolley stopper, saving the other 5 people. So the question is, do you switch or not? And let's call this dropping. Do you drop him or not? And what I'll now tell you is the majority of people say no, despite the fact that in the previous slide, they took a 3-for-1 deal. Now they don't take a 5-for-1 deal because there's something about using that human being to stop the train that feels very uncomfortable. And telling people that they live in trolley land where there's no legal implications doesn't eliminate this pattern. So people take the 3-for-1 deal when we're diverting the track. People don't take the 5-for-1 deal when we're dropping him from the bridge. Now, the only thing that I want to highlight is this may depend on how we present the problem to you. So next slide, please. And here's the third version of the problem that I want you to think about. You'll recognize yourself, you always look the same with a question mark over your head. And this time there are two trains coming down two different tracks. You'll recognize the story. On the A side, if you don't turn to switch 3 die. On the B side, if you don't turn to switch 5 die. And you can get a 3-for-1 deal or a 5-for-1 deal. You can turn switch A, you can turn switch B, you can do nothing, but you can't turn both switches. So the question is, do you turn a switch or not? And I want to highlight that in the previous 2 slides, the A switch was more popular than the B switch, dramatically more popular than A was more popular than B. But when people have this problem simultaneously, now all of a sudden, the most preferred choice becomes B. So having these problems presented jointly leads people to think in more utilitarian ways, and from the perspective of, at least of utilitarians, to behave in more ethical ways. And what I also want to tell you is thinking about choices comparatively tends to lead people to make more rational decisions. In the moral world, it tends to lead people to more utilitarian decisions, which some of us would define as more ethical as well. So what I want you to see here is that the form of presentation can affect the moral decision that people make, not to a small degree, but to a large degree. In very different research with Iris Bonet and Alexandra Van Geen, my research shows that when people compare job candidates, they tend to pay attention to job relevant criteria, and that they are less sexist, they are less racist than when they evaluate one candidate at a time. It's when we look at one person at a time, that's when our sexism and racism is more likely to affect our behavior. When we move people into a comparative mode, these biases get reduced quite dramatically. Okay, next slide. So you saw the slide before. My goal is going to try to create more utilitarian decisions. Again, I'm open to people putting some barriers on that for deontological or theological concerns, and we can certainly talk about that in our question and answer period as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so in sum so far, utilitarians switch and they push. Not everybody agrees with that, but most importantly, we can think about levers that affect human behavior. And that's what we want to do. We want to think about whether there's anything that we could do to lead human beings to create more good across all sentient beings. Okay, next slide, please. All right, now you'll recognize the slide because you saw it before. This is the harder one from a utilitarian perspective because we want to get people to drop, but not everybody kind of wants to. Next slide, please. So I want to introduce a philosopher that many of you have heard of before, John Rawls. If you haven't, no problem. We're going to bring you up to date pretty quickly. John Rawls was perhaps the most famous philosopher of the second half of the 20th century. He was a Harvard professor, so maybe I'm biased in that assessment. He was known for a couple of ideas. By the way, he was not a utilitarian, but one of the ideas that he introduced us to was something called a veil of ignorance. And the basic idea of a veil of ignorance is that if we wanted to think about what was just in the world, perhaps we need to think about it divorced from the fact that we know whether we're male or female, whether we're rich or poor, whether we live in New Hampshire or Texas. So if we want to think about how vaccines should be distributed, perhaps we should be thinking about that without thinking about who we are and how the policy would affect specifically us. So that's Rawls's notion, and he applied it to how society should be arranged at the most macro level. I want to use it to look at how we could affect how people think about more detailed, specific moral decisions. So before thinking about whether or not you want to switch in the trolley story, what I want you to now first imagine is that I want you to imagine that you are one of the 6 people in the story being affected. You're either the person on the bridge or one of the 5 people on the track, and you have a 1/6 chance of being the guy on the bridge, a 5/6 chance of being one of the 5 people on the track. And I want you to just quickly think about the question, without knowing which of the 6 you are, do you want the decision maker to turn the switch? Now, most people to this question say, turn it, okay, because they'd rather have a 5/6 chance of living than a 1/6 chance of living. The interesting part is that once people go through the exercise of thinking about what they would want the decision maker to do from an impartial understanding of who they are in the story, when we then ask them, what's the moral decision for the decision maker, they have shifted their preference. And now they lean toward seeing it as more moral for the decision maker to turn that switch. So by going through the veil of ignorance thinking, it induces people to see utilitarian choices as more moral, which is kind of interesting. As I noted, Rawls did not associate himself with utilitarian thinking, and for somewhat different reasons, actually disassociated himself from utilitarian thinking. Okay, but we've been in trolley land for a while, so let's get to something closer to the current day. So this will be a 2020 COVID problem, but we certainly can talk about 2021 COVID issues later on. So this is a 2020 problem, and it might be useful to think back to April or May of last year when we were actually doing this research. And a little bit more about utilitarians. When utilitarians think about doing the most good possible, they often move beyond, for example, saving the most lives possible to thinking about saving the most life years possible. So who should get treatment if only one person can? Sort of the very, very young person with sort of 70 years ahead, or somebody very old who's going to pass away within the next year or 2 anyhow. We make the problem a little bit less extreme in this problem, which I'll ask you to think through. And that is, who should get the scarce resource in this COVID crisis? So should a hospital, let's assume it's in Manchester, New Hampshire, they only have 1 remaining ventilator and 2 people show up. The first person who shows up is a 65-year-old, and I don't want to bias you, but as I talk to you, I'm 65 years old. So a 65-year-old shows up a short time before a 25-year-old shows up. And the medical assessment is that they both need the 1 remaining ventilator. So your question is, who should get it? Now, on a first come, first serve basis, the 65-year-old was there first. On the other hand, the 25-year-old has more expected future life years left to be saved. So the question for you, and I'll ask everyone in the audience to think about it, and obviously you can comment on it later on in the session, who should get it, the 65-year-old or the 25-year-old? And I didn't mean to overly bias you by telling you my age. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? Because I want to show you what some people decided. And it turns out that people have what psychologists call self-serving biases. They tend to see their own group as more entitled to the scarce resource, so that people 18 to 30 years old, 2/3 of them want to give the ventilator to the young person, but people over 60, 2/3 of them want to give the ventilator to the old person. Okay, so again, social psychologists explain this kind of behavior to a significant degree. But next slide, please. But then we brought in John Rawls, and you have a site at the top for those of you who want to read more on the study I'm currently telling you about. We brought in John Rawls, and we had people first imagine that they could either be the 65-year-old or 25-year-old. They don't know who they are. So we try to disassociate people from their own demographics, which seems like a hard cognitive task, and ask what would they want if there was a 50% chance that they were the 65-year-old and a 50% chance they were the 25-year-old. And then we ask them the same question we asked before of what would be more moral. And next slide, please. And the intriguing part is by having people think through the fairly difficult to work through Rawls question, we basically have eliminated the self-serving bias that we saw under the control condition. So having people work through the veil of ignorance seems to reduce self-serving bias to a quite remarkable degree. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so again, my goal is to help us all improve how we think about value creation. And if I sound at all sort of judgmental on your morality, I want you to know I'm certainly very judgmental about my own morality, and writing through this book has been the most influential book that I've ever written in terms of affecting how I think about the world. And I just want to provide some ideas about how to make more moral decisions. So one is to deliberate more rather than using your intuition. So Malcolm Gladwell wrote a very famous book called Blink. And if you want to read a set of arguments in favor of human intuition, Blink would be a fine source, but I don't really recommend it because I think that the book is not only wrong, I think it's so well written that you'll remember the wrong messages for the rest of your life. I think that there's ample evidence that deliberation leads to wiser decisions on important decisions than intuition. So there's lots of small decisions that you make where the cost of deliberating doesn't make a lot of sense. So back in the old days when we used to go to grocery stores, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to deliberate over every product choice because it would take too long. But for important decisions like what job to take, whether or not you should marry him, what house to buy, I think deliberation wins over intuition to a dramatic degree, and I think that the research evidence is consistent with that. What I now want to tell you, and consistent with what we've been looking at under the veil of ignorance and joint decision-making, is that deliberation leads to more moral decisions as well as to more rational decisions. So on important stuff, think, use your brain. That's what your university experience hopefully creates for you, is the ability to deliberate in useful and thoughtful ways. Think about where you can create value and adopt that as a mode of life. So I would like to think that I think more about my moral choices about in terms of not does it feel right, will it make someone in front of me happy in the moment, but how can I make decisions that create the most value possible? And think about the pleasure and pain we create across lots of different domains. And to see this idea, if we could go to the next slide, please. One more. Next, and one more. This is a very old cartoon, over 100 years old, and the people up there are the same person, and that's Andrew Carnegie. Many of you have heard of Carnegie Hall, Carnegie Libraries. Andrew Carnegie was one of the most important philanthropists from the early 20th century. He was also a ruthless business person who was at least heavily involved in a massacre of his own workforce where 16 people died and many people lost their jobs for the rest of their lives. many people view Carnegie as having been a ruthless business person with very questionable morals. And one of the interesting things is we often have people who are dramatically wonderful in some domains and pretty terrible in others. I would describe the current version of this cartoon as the Sackler family, who are among the most philanthropic families in the country and are also at least partially responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths and lots of other devastation from being the perpetrators of the opioid crisis. So we see this, but I'd like to suggest that all of us may have some propensity to be pretty excellent in some domains and pretty weak in others, or at least not as good as we would like in others. And I think we too easily focus on the domains where we're already pretty good. And what we might want to address is sort of thinking through what are the domains where we're weaker, where we might be able to create more benefit through other behaviors. Okay, so next slide, please. So I'm going to just quickly sort of highlight some different areas that you might think about in terms of where you could create value. One is noticing and speaking out against evil. Okay, I think that that when we read about a very bad event in society, okay, whether it's a major fraud like Bernie Madoff, or whether it's misleading tens of thousands of employees, and I think of WeWork as a moral example of that in the recent business press, or whether it's threatening democracy, we tend to read about the lead perpetrator. And Professor Latona and Professor Hubbard, I'm going back to my prior talk where I talked about noticing. Too often, we don't have enough people noticing and speaking out when other people are creating harm in the world. And I think that they become complicitors in the process. So I'm pretty confident that your audience is unlikely to be the main harm doer in a major scandal in the future. But I think it is possible for us to be in a position where we could entertain the possibility of behaviors where we would later view our behavior as complicit and allowing the bad behavior to occur. So I think it is our job to notice and speak up when we see evil developing. Reducing waste is one of my favorite topics. My spouse might think that that's because I'm cheap. But I'll give two examples of this. One is in some parts of American society, people view it as inappropriately frugal to take home a doggy bag from a restaurant. You'll remember restaurants. We used to go to them back in 2019. And if you only ate half of your dinner, should you take the second half home? Well, let's assume it tasted pretty good. You just were full. And sometimes we stigmatize the doggy bag. And when I see a doggy bag, I think that's just fantastic. Okay, it's a way to reduce waste and keep that product from ending in the garbage can. One of the I've spent a fair amount of time in Berkeley, California, and there's a pizza restaurant called Cheese Board where we used to go in and get a pizza, and a pizza is more than my spouse Marla and I would consume, but we would always take the leftovers. And if we saw somebody on the street who could use some food, we would pass the box on to them. But if not, we took it home and I would eat the pizza the next day. I think reducing waste is a good thing. Let me give you a corporate version of this. So a couple years ago, Amazon decided to look for where to put their second headquarters. And this was a massive competition where 218 different municipalities basically bid to lure Amazon to their location. And these municipalities, in some cases states, spent millions of dollars apiece to craft their proposal to increase the likelihood that they would be chosen. Now, what I want you to think about is the fact of the 218, how many had any chance at all of attracting Amazon to their location? My guess is 3, 4, 5. Some of you might think 6, 7, 8. Maybe somebody out there is thinking 18. But that means 200 municipalities spent their time and the dollars that could have been used on education, on public safety, on health, crafting proposals that had no chance of winning whatsoever. Now, Amazon's behavior was legal, but it's far from moral from a utilitarian perspective because of the destruction of value that it created for so many others around them. Time. So chapter 8 of Better Not Perfect is about how to use your time wisely. And many of you are asked to do favors. And I want you to think about how you make a decision. Now, not only are you asked to do favors for people, you also probably think your time is among your most precious commodities available. And I want to suggest that making one-off decisions about whether or not it feels good in the moment may not be the best way to make decisions about how to use time. So like Professors Latona and Hubbard, as an academic, one of the things that we do as part of our career is that we review papers that are submitted for academic publications to peer-reviewed journals. And as you age and become better known, you get more and more requests to review papers. So 15 years ago, when I turned 50, I did a review of my life to try to figure out what things in life were not fun and didn't contribute the most to society. And in addition to faculty meetings, but that's a different topic, the other big example I came up with was reviewing papers for peer-reviewed journals where the papers were not papers that I would have chosen to spend my time reading if I didn't feel a responsibility. Now, I just want to be clear, I do think that I have some responsibility to do some peer reviewing as an academic, but I was doing lots of it. So for my 50th birthday present to myself, I quit 4 editorial boards that sent me lots of papers per month. And you might be thinking, well, that doesn't make you a very nice guy. And I think it makes me better because, in fact, there are many younger scholars who liked the opportunity to be part of the process, who weren't excluded because editorial journal editors tend to know older scholars better than younger scholars. So I think I was shifting this task off of my desk onto other people who would like the task more. And hopefully I freed up my time to do other things that I could also do where I could create more value with my time. So I, in retrospect, think that that was one of the very good decisions that I've made in my life. Again, subject to criticism. And finally, donating more effectively. Next slide, please. And I'll talk a little bit about this, and I'll talk about this movement called effective altruism. And the world of effective altruism comes out of Peter Singer's work. He wrote a book, The Most Good You Can Do. Will McCaskill is one of the co-creators of the effective altruism movement, and he wrote a book called Doing Good Better. And everything on this slide I borrowed from these two excellent scholars, Peter in his 70s, Will in his 30s. And the idea of the effective altruism movement is to get people who think about charity to create more good with their dollar. So what does this mean? Well, certainly they're in favor of encouraging you to donate more. Certainly to those people listening who are making a fine salary, a dollar out of your pocket can create so much more value to other people than it creates to you, because the poorer you are, the more impact a marginal dollar has. So donating more, that's kind of easy. But who should the money go to? And the answer from the effective altruism movement is it should go where it can do the most good in the world. So what organizations are efficient and effective? This means treating the interests of all equally. So you'll remember at the beginning of the talk, one of the bullet points was equality, which everybody buys into. But then it turns out that most of us don't want to send our charitable dollars to far and distant lands. But what if your charitable dollar can have a far greater impact on bed netting in Africa to eliminate malaria than it can in Boston or the Manchester area, should we send our dollars farther away? So we have a lot of resistance to distant donation. So don't discriminate against specific groups of people. So a lot of us tend to donate to our own in-group, whether it's university, religion, nationality, or whatever. And finally, the effective altruism movement tends to think in very quantitative and analytic ways, for using metrics like QALYs, and QALY stands for quality adjusted life year. So how can I create the most quality adjusted life year possible? So now this word of effective altruism is growing rapidly. It tends to not be very popular in the older than 50-year-old crowd. So effective altruism conferences are sort of flooded with young tech-leaning people who like the analytics of it and are attracted to creating the most good that can possibly be done. And it's also clearly associated with utilitarianism, which again, not everybody necessarily endorses. Okay, and I'm going next, skip that slide next, please. Okay, so where does the money go under effective altruism? So the effective altruism community tends to send the money to the very poorest in the world. And by the definition of effective altruism, there aren't that many of those people in the United States. So the very poorest means the very poorest. To reduce suffering by animals in factory farming. So again, the goal is to minimize suffering across all sentient beings. This does not mean that an ant is as important as a human. It simply means that a unit of suffering should be treated equally, and therefore we should be concerned about the massive suffering that goes on in our factory farming systems. And finally, many people believe that we should be focusing more on future generations because we can create far more good for future generations when we are no longer alive. And that means taking issues like climate change more seriously. Next slide, please. And so this is my wrap up, and then we can open up to questions. The purpose of this talk is to get us all thinking about how we can be better without being perfect. I was giving a talk, I was talking to a philosopher at the University of Vermont about these ideas. And when I was talking about them, he said that in the environmental world, people talk about maximal sustainable yield. How much of the forest can you take down so that the forest sustains itself and grows back in a healthy way? And he suggested that what I was talking about was helping people identify their maximal sustainable goodness. So it's not perfect utilitarianism, which is completely unreasonable for us to achieve. But can we create more good and move to a more sustainable level of higher goodness? We could do that by donating more, but we can also do that by deliberating more. Deliberative decisions tend to create more value. By focusing on creating as much good as we can as a goal, in sum, to be better, even if you can't be perfect. With that, I'm going to stop talking and turn the floor back over to Professors Latona and Hubbard, as they've been reading the chat and I haven't been, and I'm happy to address any issues that are coming up.
So thank you, Professor Bazerman, for your talk. I will start out, and just as a reminder, if you would like to join the Q&A, ask a question, can do it at any point by clicking that Q&A box. So you talked, I think you touched on this at the end about the maximum sustainable goodness. But what are the limits to this kind of utilitarian deliberation that you are suggesting? Because one of the critiques often of utilitarianism is that there's just simply not enough time, and nobody has that much energy to maximize the best possible outcomes in every situation. So, you have any suggestions, kind of on the individual level, for how far we should go with this?
So terrific question. So I hope that my talk, I hope that the talk in the book sort of confront your question directly, because this notion of I can't be a perfect utilitarian is in many ways the theme of the book. That's why it's better not perfect. I'm not encouraging you to be a perfect utilitarian, because there are limitations. A limitation is that all of us care about our family more than we care about people who we've never met in the world. And there's probably some very good long-term benefit to overvaluing people close to us. But I think sometimes we sort of do that too dramatically, and we harm people who aren't part of our group. So I think we can think about that. Sort of, are there times when we want to broaden our net? So I don't think you should give away sort of 90% of your income because people in sub-Saharan Africa need those dollars more than you do. I don't think that that's a reasonable demand. And I even think that sort of pushing people toward a completely unreasonable goal will turn people off, and they're more likely to quit giving than they are to give away 90% of their income. But I think thinking about sort of, would your life be fine if you increased your donations by 10% over last year? Okay, that may be a completely viable option, but maybe not. Could you at least give your donations more thought? So could you think about how to have more bang for your buck and making the world a better place? So now I'm not asking for more of your money, I'm asking for more of your thought. I'll give you one quick sort of thought example on that. Many of us donate money in two different ways. One, we get periodic requests throughout the year for donations, and we tend to make an affective assessment of, do I want to donate or not? And then many of us also stop at the end of the year and decide to make our yearly contributions to charity, where we think about multiple options at the same time. I would predict that the decisions that are made comparatively lead to more effective altruism than decisions that we make sort of one at a time. So I think that if we can think about ways to improve the effectiveness of our decisions, we can become better. So I'm far, far, far from a perfect human being, but I'm pretty confident that I was better in 2020 than I was in 2019. And my goal is to be better in 2021 than I was in 2020. And that feels like an achievable goal. And it also feels like a goal that will make me happy to reach. So, but the question is, what does better mean? And I use utilitarianism not as sort of as a state that I expect to get to, but simply as a North Star of what I'm aiming for. I'm trying to create more value in the world. And I want to do a chunk better this year than last year. And by the way, I think that when we sort of accept that goal, that we're moving toward our maximal sustainable goodness, and it almost becomes self-fulfilling that the following year you're going to want to be even better than you were in the current year. So it's a different trajectory on life where sort of I want to completely and totally accept that utilitarianism isn't a reasonable state to get to. It's a reasonable direction to aim for. And in many ways, so if we go back to my very early slide on decision making, I'm a fan of you making more rational decisions, where rational is defined as decisions that will allow you to accomplish more of what you want to accomplish. Okay. But I don't have any hopes that I'm ever going to be perfectly rational. So I can use something as a North Star, either in terms of my decision-making or morality, without necessarily expecting to get to that North Star in the end. And Professor Hubbard, if I'm not answering your question, feel free to push back on that.
So Kyle, we have a question from the audience, which I'd be happy to read. So Becca asks, when making decisions about donations and philanthropy, how can we truly know our best contribution?
Yeah.
For example, if the person on the bridge is a philanthropist himself, or Mother Teresa, or MLK Jr., you get my point, saving that person may be more valuable than saving the 5 hikers on the track. Are there resources for considering these bigger picture contributions when deciding how to allocate money, time, and energy? Great question, Becca.
Absolutely. Thank you, Becca. So first of all, Becca, if we go back to the trolley problems, I intentionally didn't want to tell you who the people are. I wanted you to think about anonymous people so that we didn't have the additional problems that you were introducing. I wanted to focus on how the mode of decision-making, one train versus 2 trains, could have such a dramatic influence on whether or not we acted in a more utilitarian way. So I don't think that we're going to get any consensus among all the people on the call about how we should value specific people. And that certainly wouldn't be my goal. But I certainly would say that some people are more important, but part of the reason that they're more important is that they can create more value for others. So let's go with the vaccine that's on many of our minds. One of the wise decisions that I think was being made was to give it to frontline health workers first. Okay, why should they get it first? Because they can keep the rest of us safe and healthy. So there's a multiplier effect by focusing on people who can affect the lives of lots of other people. And so I think from a sophisticated utilitarian perspective, we want to give priority to those healthcare workers. We also want to make sure that they're willing to stay there in the hospitals, making the rest of us better. So absolutely, there's some people who are simply going to create more benefit to others. In terms of the question of how to make comparisons, I think it's very difficult, for example, to compare across the 3 domains that I suggested that the effective altruists value most: the poorest of the world, animal suffering, and future generations. Certainly people try to do it, but I think it's complex. But what I would say is within category, some organizations are simply having greater impact than others. So let's assume that you're a big animal fan. And by the way, I'm a big animal fan. And I love my dog tremendously. I think dogs are the best thing imaginable. But I think that the American charitable dollar goes to animal shelters rather than factory farming to an unfortunate degree. I think that we can save far more animal suffering by redirecting within the animal category to where the most suffering could be reduced. In terms of guidance, I'll give you 2 different websites that might be interesting to take a look at. One is givingmultiplier.org. So the two words put together as one, givingmultiplier.org, which was recently created by colleagues in the psychology department at Harvard, which will lay out the case for how you can create more effective altruism. And a more longer lasting site that's been around for a while is GiveWell. Again, GiveWell is one word.org. And both of them, I think, provide excellent advice on how to think through the hard questions that you're asking. The other thing about Becca's question is that I want to highlight it is a very tough problem. And quantifying pleasure and pain will always be difficult. And the effective altruism confronts that directly, and that's why they create these strange metrics like QALYs to help solve the task that Becca's asking about. But I want to close by saying, just because it's hard doesn't mean that we shouldn't try hard to estimate where we can create the most good. And some issues are easy rather than hard, where we could easily see the inefficiency. I'll give you a quick one, the quick rule of thumb. When someone calls you on the telephone and asks you for a charitable donation to a cause, you probably don't want to give over the phone, because that's probably a for-profit company that's going to take a large percent of that money rather than actually passing it on to charity. So charities do not harass you by phone without the involvement of intermediaries. And it simply isn't effective to be paying a for-profit intermediary who's taking the majority of the funds. So I think that there's lots of moves that we can make in the right direction, despite it being a very tough task.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question that came in from Molly. Actually, she has a couple here, but I'll ask her first one. She asks, how does one work to maximize the good for most without neglecting those on the two ends of the bell curve? For example, in the context of schools, there's the gifted end and those with special needs. Or in her work in politics, she says, I'm not sure what policies that aim to create maximum value for the average person who in New Hampshire is white, middle-aged, and middle class. What does that do to move towards maximal sustainable goodness for communities of color and the poor?
Yeah, terrific question. And I don't want to represent myself as an education expert. I'm far from that. But I also don't want to avoid the question. So I teach I'm very fortunate to teach at a very well-off university that has lots of resources. And I do think about the issue of sort of where should limited resources go. And you could easily imagine that there are many gifted people at Harvard. And it's my job to educate them as well as I possibly can. And I do my best to fulfill that obligation. But as a society or as a donor, do I want to direct more money to the most gifted? I think you can make an argument for it, because there may be people there who can change the world in dramatic ways. But I think that there's too many people already targeting those efforts. In terms of the poor versus the center of the curve, I think that if we can find ways to bring up the poorest part of the curve, we have more potential carryover benefit to the rest of the society. On the other hand, if we aren't solving those problems effectively, then obviously we want to think about other opportunities that should be created. I think you have similar issues in terms of who should get the vaccine first. So our country and most states have gone with sort of after healthcare workers, that the oldest should get it first. And despite my advancing age, I'm not sure that we're creating the most benefit possible. There's something nice sounding about it, but when we think about sort of quality adjusted life years that we're creating, I'm not sure that I endorse a preference for the oldest first. And we kind of saw that in the earlier ventilator story. we're certainly not sort of adopting a quality of life years first in terms of the vaccine story. So I think it's a very hard question. Given my earlier comments, I certainly think that people at the poorest end should be given first consideration of where we can have the most impact, where we have the most upside potential, but we also want to find ways to contribute in ways that are effective in solving the problems for the poorest in the world.
I wonder if I could jump in with a question of my own. Max, I was intrigued by the mention of the Sackler family, which is being held responsible for the opioid crisis in the United States. Yeah. But you had mentioned that they were very giving, very generous in their philanthropy, which I actually was unaware of. Now, I would imagine that that example would fail the sort of utilitarian calculus because of the sheer amount of suffering that the opioid crisis has created. So, but I'm wondering if, in general, a utilitarian wouldn't defend a corporation using unsavory business practices as long as the profits that they're producing with those practices are, used for charitable, philanthropic purposes. Maybe Carnegie is a good example of that. He was apparently a very exacting employer, but was one of the great benefactors in this country. So how would a utilitarian deal with that? I mean, what would they say to corporate executives in terms of their decision making to maybe prevent them from making those kinds of decisions?
Yeah. So to begin with, I could imagine sort of. So I don't see profit maximization as a bad thing. I think making money is a good thing. I'm a believer in capitalism, and I'm concerned when there's too much corporate favoritism that destroys a variety of incentives and things like that. So I'm uncomfortable, Professor Latona, with the notion that that I can be abusive to my students as long as I donate a very large amount of money at the end of the year. So it doesn't sound like the right way to build society. And I think that there's all kinds of second order harms to that. And so similarly, in the Sackler, I think the Sackler story is easy because I think the harm is far greater than the value of the museums and the contributions to universities. So I think that the harm has been just enormous. But if we imagine a world where it's hard to balance, I'm not too wild about allowing corporate profiteers off the hook because they donated a lot to charity. So I could see how I could see the logic in the question, but I think the second order costs, which should also be considered by a utilitarian, create problems for accepting that kind of logic. For me, I think of the Carnegie cartoon more as a way to say, Max, don't focus just on things where you get a pretty good score. Maybe take a look at where your scores are weakest and see if you could improve your scores on that front as well.
Great, thank you.
So we have a question from James, who asks about this general approach and whether it is overly focused on individuals rather than communities. So he asks, the approach to utilitarianism and maximum impact seems to be based on the Western value system, valuing individuals over communities, as opposed to a more Eastern value system, valuing communities over individuals. So he asks if you could speak to this.
So, sure. So I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. I think it's intriguing to think about. So I'm not sure I know what the utility of a community is beyond the value to all the people in the community, plus the value of future generations of that community. So when I think of sort of valuing the community in terms of protecting the ecosystem, the physical ecosystem of a community, why do we want to protect that ecosystem? We want to do it so that future generations can also get benefit. utilitarians clearly include the utilities of people who aren't yet alive in identifying what will be the most good. So, so it may be that the person asking the question has an image of the community as a entity in and of itself. I tend to think of a community as comprising the current and future members, and also non-human members of that community as the value that we're trying to maximize.
So we have been talking, this presentation is focused a lot on individual choices that we can make. Yet a lot of us, maybe on this call, are also lead companies, are business leaders, right? We employ people, maybe we're teachers, and so we have students. And so we're making them spend a lot of time doing things that we want them to do. So is there, do you have suggestions for how employers or teachers, bosses could help their organizations and their employees at these organizations do the kinds of things that you're talking about here?
Great question. So first of all, let me add one more group. Parents, because parents also influence the decisions of other people. Those are the short people running around your house, and grandparents for that matter. And what I want to say is sort of, you are a role model. We're all role models. Other people pick up cues based on our own behavior. But we also can think about policies that we create. And in the family, we might call these household roles. In corporations, we might think about these as policies. And I think that it makes complete sense to think about, how do we identify policies that lead the organization to create the most good that it possibly can. 50 years ago, there was a very famous paper by Milton Friedman, where he's an economist who made the moral argument that the obligation of the firm is to maximize shareholder welfare, and that alone. And that's very inconsistent with most moral philosophies that existed for hundreds of years. And Friedman did a phenomenal job of convincing people not only was that a moral philosophy, but that it was part of the law, which it never was. And I think that can create an awful lot of harm. And I think that all of us might want to think about sort of, when our time is over, meaning we're retired, or even if we're in our final days, what do we want to have accomplished? Was it to maximize the number of dollars our company made? Was it to educate the largest number of students possible? Was it to get the best teacher ratings that we possibly could? I think none of those sound right to me. I think a metric focusing on, did I create as much good as I could, seems like a far better metric that we would all want to use to judge ourselves in terms of how we influence the organizations that we're a part of.
Well, thank you for that response, and for your responses to these questions, and for your presentation.
Thank you.
I know we could keep this discussion going, but for the sake of everybody's lunch hour and getting back to what people need to do, we're going to wrap this up now. So if I were in the room, I would tell you to give Professor Bazerman a round of applause, but there's only little emojis to do that on Zoom. So, but thank you, Professor Bazerman, for your enlightening talk and for the discussion that followed. And thanks to all of you who offered questions. I apologize we didn't get to all the questions that were there. But the Center for Ethics will be hosting more online events, so pay attention to your email campus announcements. And we hope to host some events soon. So for those that are off campus, we hope to welcome you to the Hilltop in the coming months, and at least by next school year. That's the hope. So have a wonderful day.
Thank you, professors, and thank you for everybody who joined. And Mason, thank you for your help on the IT side.
Thank you, Professor Bazerman.